Welcome to the Rogue Startups Podcast, where two startup founders are sharing lessons learned and pitfalls to avoid in their online businesses. And now, here's Dave and Craig.
All right, welcome to another episode of Rogue Startups. Today, I have the famous Adii Pienaar from WooThemes fame, also the founder of Public Beta, and currently the founder of Conversio, who just got acquired by Campaign Monitor. Adii, welcome.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks for having me.
I'm very glad to have you here today. So, Adii and I have known each other for, years and years at this point, right? So the first MicroConf, you were there, you were a speaker. We chatted a little bit then, and then reconnected at Shopify like a year ago. And so we've known each other for a while. And what's kind of unusual and kind of different about today is that Adii and I are actually competitors. So you're the first competitor I've ever had on the show.
Yes.
Which is funny. But Adii is awesome. And for those of you that don't know Adii, I would strongly recommend, and there'll be some stuff in the show notes for links to his blog and things like that. I would strongly recommend that you take some time and get to know him, get to know his products, because Adii is an amazing founder. So, Adii, I'm glad to have you here today. Is there anything you'd like to tell the audience before we jump in here?
Well, I'm also very grateful for all the very kind words and compliments, Dave. I think though everyone else should just make up their own minds and at least find some dirt on me, right? Just to kind of balance out, all these compliments, because otherwise I'm just going to be way too uncomfortable over here.
Well, I did dig up some dirt on you, and I was going to save this for later in the show, but it's kind of hilarious, so I'm going to throw it out there now. I found it was like this weirdo site, so I Googled you for a second to see if there was anything that was on the press release for Campaign Monitor. And what I found was that there's like this Wiki South Africa thing. Did you know that you're one of 10 youngest African billionaires?
I have heard this rumor, actually, yes. If you find the real me out there in the world, because obviously I'm not that guy, right? But if you find him, he's obviously used my name and he's obviously made billions. So I would just like some kind of royalty. He can have some of it. I would just like some kind of royalty.
Well, they have your picture on the site, which, makes it even weirder. But I was wondering, what was it like hanging out with Bezos and Gates? And, do you have lunch with Buffett? Do you take calls from the other billionaires? Do you guys call each other and say, hey, how's it going, Bill?
Yeah, it is basically something like that. Yes. I mean, it's very boring as well. We mostly just count money when we meet up. So it's not really that interesting.
Well, you've totally blown my entire thing about billionaires now. I'm very disappointed, Adii. Yeah.
Sorry. This unicorn thing, guys. I mean, it's not what it's all kind of made out to be.
All right. Well, all right. So let's get into something a little more interesting here, besides being the 10th youngest billionaire in South Africa. All right. So you have been a founder for a very long time. What year was WooThemes founded?
So I built the first WooThemes product end of 2007, and then we officially founded WooThemes in the following year, so mid 2008.
Right. So long time ago. And,
Yeah, especially in internet years, right? I mean, 12 years in internet years time is what, 50 normal years.
Right. In dog years, you're 178 at this point, right?
Exactly, which means I can't be the youngest or 10th youngest billionaire in Africa. It has to be at least 20th or something, because I'm old.
Well, we'll make sure to correct that with those guys later on.
Thanks.
All right. So you've gone through WooThemes. You had an exit there. You then turned around and did Public Beta, which went somewhere, and then you decided you were going to move on from that. And then you moved on to Conversio. So you've been through a lot of different scenarios here. You've bootstrapped, you've funded, you've had companies that were not as successful as your previous ventures. And so then you founded Conversio here. So Conversio's been around since 2014, is that right?
Yeah, launched late 2014.
Okay, so you've been doing Conversio for 5 years. when you and I had a conversation at Shopify, you've got people working for you, Conversio is profitable. What was it that made you want to get acquired this time? You were doing okay. Why not just tough it out as a bootstrapper, or why not get funding? What about acquisition was the right answer for you guys this time?
Yeah, that's a really good question because I think many founders think, when they think about exit, at least, and this is, I like to just take a step back to kind of WooThemes days, right? But the one thing that I learned kind of that stuck with me from the WooThemes exit, obviously there's loads of things, but the one thing that is relevant here was this idea that once you build something and you sell and you have to start from scratch, you have to do all the hard work, all over again. And yes, like you probably, like if I take my situation, WooThemes, yes, I had some of my own capital, which I used to, eventually self-fund Conversio. Yes, I had, a reputation. I had network, I had friends, I had skills, experience. All of those things obviously helped in the next thing. But kind of getting into the next thing is still hard, right? So I kind of, shortly thereafter, I got into that kind of mindset and early days of Conversio, which was, let's just build something and run this thing forever and ever, right? Because I never wanted to have to kind of, start from zero, with that blank canvas and, have to find customers. Because I think that's by far the hardest thing to do these days, with any tech business, is finding that, initial attention and then, finding enough of it to actually kind of build a business, right? So that was for the larger part of Conversio's 5 years. That was my mindset. Like, this is something that I would I want to work on very, very long term. I think what ultimately kind of changed my mind there was the fact that we had definitely kind of the last 2 years had been tough. We had, I don't think we had figured out kind of our marketing, for example. We had not figured out kind of our growth challenges. And email generally, or marketing automation, marketing tech, whatever sector you're going to use, or whatever label you want to use for the sector, it is very competitive as well. So it kind of, I think the choice, I don't think it's just a binary thing, but the choice kind of was, yes, run this for as long as we can, independently, and extract as much, value from that, but then run the risk of, kind of just competition and the ecosystem shifting on us, or the market shifting, or find a really good home for this, extract some value, which I think as a founder and entrepreneur diversifies my own financial situation, and then essentially use that new home for the product to pursue all the kind of ideas that we had before as well. And I think when I think about Campaign Monitor, at least, they ticked many of those boxes for me, at least in terms of, diversifying, as I said, diversifying my own kind of financial situation, and giving us a really great home to say, we built this thing. This is obviously a product that works and is significant enough for a big company like Campaign Monitor to want to acquire it. But how do we pour, kind of more fuel on these flames now? So I think that's broadly kind of, the way, kind of what made up my mind in the end, and just kind of how that also kind of shifted from, both from WooThemes and the start to, of Conversio towards the latter stages and exiting.
Yeah, I totally hear you on the whole competitive landscape there, because if you're talking about e-commerce, email marketing, it's getting very, very difficult to differentiate yourself in that space. And I feel that pain. You and I have talked about that pain at Shopify. Others that are coming into the space, they are having the same struggles there. And the ones that are staying on top are only barely staying on top because, they have market share and they're doing the right features for the customers. But I always feel like, if you get one or two key features behind, your market is going to shift under your feet right there. That's what it's always felt like to me. I don't know about you.
Yeah, well, yes, totally. I think, when, and this probably not exclusive to kind of the marketing space or the e-commerce space. There's probably other sectors where the exact same thing is true. But I think when we play in a landscape where there are so many big funded competitors, they don't even have to be funded, right? They could just be, just massive and have, a massive war chest to do things. I think the risk is always there that they, with their size and their speed or their ability to put out things, they can essentially skew a market, right? And they can skew a customer's kind of perception and expectation, in terms of what they want from others, right? And yes, they sometimes then kind of, I think where those bigger corps kind of leave the gap is normally either in overcomplicating a product or not having great customer service or overpricing, like not being cost efficient, right? And that creates the gaps for smaller independent companies to then come in and build viable businesses. But I think the risk is still there for teams and companies to really nail that and to essentially threaten the livelihood of smaller independent companies. So I think, as I don't think it's just exclusive to our space. I think that's true for most software spaces at this stage.
That's a good point. That's a great point. Now, you didn't just get this offer cold from Campaign Monitor. You've actually had a relationship with them for a long time. Can you talk a little bit about like how, you went from customer of Campaign Monitor to, hey, we'd like to acquire you guys. That seems like there's a map of something going on in between there that isn't entirely clear. And, I realize you may not be able to talk about everything, but, talk about what you can on that.
Yeah. And I mean, like the disclaimer here is I'm definitely, a couple of rounds of beers short of connecting all of the dots here. I think what I can say is this, though. I think the fun part of the story is that we were, Campaign Monitor customers with WooThemes back in the day. And I think kind of way back then, it was just as I think SaaS started being, became more popular and more people at least started talking about it, right? I mean, there was the days of kind of, the Basecamp 37 signals back then, coming out of the woodwork basically and saying, hey, here's a viable way to go from consulting into kind of product, right? And I can remember back in the day, we were on 37 Signals, they were doing like a whole set of feature posts that they called Bootstrap, Profitable, and Proud. And we featured alongside Campaign Monitor, which I said, I mean, it's just one of those things. I've referenced that article because it's still online. I've referenced it so often just because it was so cool. It was so cool to kind of be side by side with Campaign Monitor, who was, at least by kind of, I never knew numbers, but they were always the bigger company, right? They had, like, we were the kind of the unknown, company down south and, Cape Town, South Africa, right? But Campaign Monitor had these beautiful offices and, in Sydney. So it was always a very kind of aspirational company for us, at least, both for myself, Mark, and Magnus, right? And I eventually got, I believe it was 2012, where I actually kind of got to meet Dave Greiner, who's one of the co-founders of Campaign Monitor. Met him at Business of Software in Boston, and we just kind of, I mean, I wouldn't kind of name drop here and claim that Dave is kind of my biggest friend, but like he is a friend and we kept in touch. And I can remember like in the early days with Conversio, when we were still called Receiptful, for example, I didn't know how to price this thing. And I actually emailed Dave for help. And like the one thing I can remember is he steered me clear of pay-as-you-go pricing for email, which I think is now an absolute kind of blessing, right? That I didn't say no. So like I said, I think that's the fun part here, is that there was, regardless of Conversio itself or the ultimate acquisition, there were different ties. I had a different kind of relationship with Campaign Monitor as a brand and with some of the people there. So I think that is pretty cool. As for the deal, that's why I made kind of the disclaimer about the rounds of beers. I do not know how much that kind of past and that relationship that I had with Campaign Monitor actually played into how like we became a viable or interesting option for acquisition for them. So yeah, as I said, I need to buy a few people a few beers and figure and connect a few dots on that one.
Well, I'd be happy to sit down with you and do that sometime.
Yeah.
The reason that I was asking those is that, as a founder of a company that, may someday actually get acquired, it's interesting to kind of see what was the landscape and how did that sort of evolve? Like, where were the serendipities and the opportunities that turned into a lucky break? or an actual path to acquisition. So that's what I was trying to get at here. So sort of getting along that same thing here. I presume that you probably went around and shopped Conversio or had other offers once you started doing that. You went with Campaign Monitor, obviously. What made you turn the others down if you had them?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the first thing I can say there, by the way, and I highly recommend the following. I what ultimately preceded this whole process was I chatted with had a chat with Rob Walling at MicroConf in Dubrovnik in November, and Rob introed me to Einar, who is his partner at TinySeed. But Einar also runs Discretion Capital and essentially does M&A advisory and brokering, right? And I think in just kind of approaching this and getting to a point where we did have multiple offers to consider, multiple options, as an even broader definition here, like Einar was having someone experienced in that process was incredibly helpful. So like that's definitely for any founder out there considering selling their business in future, get great advice and help, right? In terms of actually deciding between kind of the offers, I think like there were things that were important to me, right? I think the least important part was the kind of the ultimate valuation, right? Because I think if the valuation is fair, at least, right? 5% left or right, or 10% left or right, becomes immaterial, at least in comparison to other considerations. So like that is part of it, but I don't think for me at least that was not the biggest motivator here. The things that I was more keen about was finding a new home for the product and the team that would essentially allow both of those to flourish. And I think in doing so, kind of there had to be a similar kind of culture and similar values at least. So I think those are ultimately those are my biggest considerations. And then as I said, I think the day that Campaign Monitor expressed interest, they essentially had the inside lane, right? Because of that. Just that bond and affinity that I had with the brand. So I mean that's that very subjective part ultimately played a big role as well.
Yeah, sounds a lot like the same sort of considerations that Rob was having with Drip and Lead Pages. That culture fit and his team were like really top of his mind there, and anything that would compromise those was off the table immediately. Sounds like it was the same.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think as the one thing that I think as a founder, like in terms of building a brand and building a reputation, like the worst thing, or what? No, probably maybe not the worst thing, but like that the way you deal with your team in an acquisition, I think you get a reputation for that kind of thing, right? And again, like we had a small team, at the point of exit, we were 11 people, so it is possible that even if I was being a bit of a dick, that completely kind of that narrative completely vanishes, and 5 or 10 years down the line when I'm working on a new thing and trying to sell that, whatever the case is, then nobody remembers what Adii did to his first team, or his previous team. But that's not a risk that I think is worthwhile to take. I think being respectful and honoring what a team has kind of built together should be important. I don't think it should be just for a founder, at least, to be like almost pump and dump kind of thing. So hence why that was so important, because I think that kind of thing, I think it's possible to get a really bad reputation, as a founder and as an entrepreneur if you don't at least try your best to find a great home for for your team in an acquisition.
Yeah, I like using the whole pump and dump thing there. Like that should not be your goal there. Yeah, I totally agree. So as a 2-exit founder, what would you say was harder about this exit than the one from Woo?
Well, I think semantically at least, Woo was easier because I sold to Magnus and Mark, right? So they remained in the business. The business essentially repurchased my equity. So I think the complexity there was different. The kind of I was also just younger and more immature, so which made that kind of exit much harder and much harder than it needed to be. I think with this exit, and again, like I think this is an absolute saving grace in hindsight. But once we had a LOI signed, Einar said you have to get the absolute best M&A legal counsel that you can on this deal, and we ultimately found a firm that was very experienced, and they did a fantastic job in terms of guiding us through that process. Without them, like it would have been really hard. Well, it would have been even harder, trying to just learn so many things. I think, there was definitely kind of technical complexity in terms of the legal side of things that was really tough here. Like that was really tough. And I think related to that, like we had a really short amount of time from kind of signing LOI to closing, and that was intentional. I think having a short time to close is good in many ways, right? You almost de-risk things going south, right, to some extent, because there's a lot of momentum. But it's also just like within 2 months, like kind of getting the acquisition over the line, took over my whole life, right? So I think those things. It was just hard for 2 months, for 3 months overall. It was just a really challenging time.
Yeah. And having a short close time also helps avoid buyer remorse too.
well, one would hope so, right? I mean, yeah. I mean, nobody in the group has told me just yet that can they exchange us? Where's the warranty? Everyone seems pretty happy, and we've done some good work since the transaction closed. So yeah, so I'm not aware of any buyer's remorse just yet.
That's good. All right, so let's pull out to a broader picture for a second. You, like me and like Craig on the show, we're all family men. So we have kids, we have a wife, we have a life outside of being an entrepreneur. How has your journey changed from Woo through public beta to Conversio? What things, are you just no longer willing to do today that you would have done back in the Woo days?
Ooh, I don't think there's anything, to be honest, actually, that I wouldn't do now that I kind of, would have done back then. I think, I love how Natalie from Wildbit, she has a tweet where she basically, a couple of months ago, she said, because there was this whole thing about kind of hustle porn, right, and entrepreneurs and founders working way too hard, and then experienced successful founders almost shaming, kind of, I would say, newer founders, like in terms of their journey, right, or younger founders in terms of their journey, and saying like you shouldn't work 80-hour weeks. And then she basically said like that's complete bullshit, because most of us at some stage worked 80 hours, weeks for years to get kind of our business off the ground, right? So I think to that extent, at least, you ultimately find a way to get things done as a founder. And I don't think that there's really, except for the kind of the obvious ethical things and criminal things, I don't think there is really anything that's off limits for me. What I will say though is, like, I mean, towards the end of WooThemes, my first son was born, and we now have two boys. They're almost 8 and almost 5, right? And I think I have been more reluctant to work so hard or work in a way that I can't be present for them. So whether that means physically present, right, being in front of my desk and not being able to physically spend time with them, or working in such a way that I get into such a frenzied state mentally and emotionally that I'm physically present with them, but I'm not really kind of present. So that's something that I really try to be much more aware of, just personally at least, and having better boundaries, right? And that's definitely that translated at least to kind of what we try to do within the team, right? So we installed certain things in the team, and like in terms of our values, in terms of our culture. And what ended up happening, which I am now I think that's probably one of the things that I'm most proud about in terms of what we created, was the fact that we got to a point where as a team we defined our culture as being family and life first, with ideas simply being that we want to do fun, challenging, stimulating work. But the most meaningful experiences that we can have is outside of work, right? We're friends at work, but we don't work is not our lives, right? Life is the rest of the kind of life, right? Work just kind of fits into that. So I think, as I said, that's from my side, just personally, that was more of a awareness to try and gravitate towards that more often, to try and optimize for that outcome more often, instead of necessarily saying there's definitely some things here that I will or won't kind of do in terms of my work.
Yeah, more work to live, not live to work. Although, yeah, it sounds like you might be a little bit like me in that if you can get into a state where you're just like totally focused on the work, and that it actually requires some mental awareness to say, all right, I'm way too deep into this and it's taking me away from the things that I consider important. And so I have to separate that and make an actual boundary of it.
Yeah, totally. And you know what, David? I think the best, I wouldn't say the best thing that I did. I did do a good thing, and I'll explain that now. But the first is not that. I want to say that, having a partner, my wife in this sense, that is that like her. I think she's learned over the years to pick up on my cues in terms of when I'm too, kind of way too deep down a rabbit hole somewhere in terms of work. And she actually has a way to either create space or kind of pull me out of it. So having that has been great, right? And then from my side, when she does take up that cue, to understand that this is someone that's observed me, for a couple of days, couple of weeks, couple of months sometimes, and has figured out that listen here, something at work is off, and it's putting me out of equilibrium. So I think that's in terms of those kind of boundaries, that's been helpful. And the other thing, and that's what kind of I think the best thing that I did, which is very counter to what I think most people would say. I hired my best friend, who was kind of ultimately became our COO, and he became my 2IC, and which meant we totally blurred all lines in terms of kind of friendship and professional kind of work, right? I mean, there when we hung out and had beers, the conversation could be about work, for example, right? There was I don't think both of us weren't necessarily great at those boundaries, but what that did as well, at least but that's my perspective, right? The benefit that I got there was that I always felt connected to what was going on at work, but I also felt connected to what was going on in the rest of my life via just in that kind of single kind of relationship and friendship, right? Because it was constantly, I wouldn't say necessarily pulling, but reminding me of both those things in a very contextual way. Because I think that's the hard thing with at least friendships. Most friends that I can talk to and say, shit, I've had a really tough year at work, but they don't necessarily have the context, right? And they're not investors in your business, or in my case, they don't have 70% equity of the business, so it's not the same, right? But having someone in the business that's also your best mate, they have that context, and they can seamlessly shift from between both those worlds. Yeah.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, I would not have expected that, and that's definitely a very unique situation. I have lots of good friends, but they're not necessarily overlapping in tech. And then some that are overlapping in tech, I think we are good friends, but I don't know that we'd necessarily be good business partners. So that's really awesome that you had that mixture there that worked really well. That was super cool.
Yeah, and the coolest thing, by the way, we the two of us have a third mate, and I poached them from our other mate's company, which makes us who is also who was an investor in kind of Conversio as well. So it's a very incestuous kind of thing going on here, obviously. But yeah, I mean, I think all of those things. I think it's totally counter. Most people say, don't do business with friends. I totally think there's a place to do that, because if you can't trust your friends, who can you trust?
Exactly. All right, let's pull back a little bit further here. We talked a lot about your new company and your journey here as an entrepreneur. I'd like to hear a little bit about what you think in the e-commerce space, because obviously as a guy in Conversio, and you've been working in there for years at this point with WooCommerce and Conversio both. What do you think the future holds in e-commerce right now? Like, what's going to be a commodity in 5 years, and what's going to be a differentiator that we don't see today?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I wish I had that crystal ball, right? I mean, and Dave, I know you're obviously asking because, like, whatever I'm going to say, you're just going to take that crystal ball and you're going to build it, right?
Well,
Capitalize
maybe. I mean, part of it, I think, is there. There's enough people in our audience that are looking to build businesses and trying to figure out what would they, where would they want to go? Where's the puck going to move on the ice, right? And obviously, I'm interested in that too, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it would overlap with what I'm doing in recapture. But I like talking about e-commerce in general and just sort of speculating where do you think it's going to go? Because there's lots of crazy shit that's out there.
Yeah.
So what's your crazy shit?
Yeah. So you know what? I think that the thing that I often come back to, and they're linked to two things, right? It's always so top of mind for me. So I think the first thing is, profitability, right? I don't think we speak or profitability gets mentioned enough in the e-commerce kind of space, right? And like specifically, this is we probably need 7 hours for me to go off on this tangent, but I'll keep it to 3 sentences. I mean, my wife runs an e-commerce business, and like I know, for example, because I have an accounting degree, right? So I understand accounting, and just using shitty inventory software to get her like accurate, COGS, cost of goods, sold figures is really hard, right? And if you can't do that, then you have no idea of profitability, right? So, and I think if you don't know whether and how you're profitable in your e-commerce business, then it's not sustainable, right? So I think that's the kind of the first thing that I think is interesting in the next couple of years is how kind of the profitability plays out. And then the second part to that is down to kind of customer acquisition cost, right? And the channels that we use for that. Because I think what we're already seeing at least is that, Facebook ads, Google ads, all of those in most kind of markets have become like the cost of has gone up and the ads have become less effective, right? Engagement is down, conversion rates is down, right? So if you layer on top of that all the kind of the dissonance, with those companies and data privacy and like just the shitty bad vibes people have with them. And I know that this is probably more us because we're in the tech space and like we're the early adopters and we feel that more, but that's going to kind of bubble up, right? And it's definitely going to hit the mainstream in the next couple of years where the sentiment towards those companies is going to change. Like people might not be clicking on ads at all, might not be using Facebook at all in 5 years' time. And I think the reason I mentioned that related to profitability, right, is that customer acquisition cost, again, another thing beyond kind of your inventory costs that influences profitability. But as soon as you take that away in terms of where do I find customers, like that is a question that the e-commerce ecosystem will have to solve for, right? How do you find customers if you absolutely can't at no cost, use Facebook or Google or Instagram or whatever the cool kids are using these days. But I think those, as for me at least, those are my biggest questions that I have for e-commerce for the next couple of years.
Those are pretty solid ones, yeah. The profitability one, yeah. Approaching that from recapture, we always look at it from the how are people converting? What kind of revenue are you making? What's the customer lifetime value? What's average order value? Stuff like that. So that's all on the input side, but on the output side for the cost of goods sold, you're right. If you don't know what that number is and you don't have a really solid idea, you're screwed because you can have all kinds of stuff coming in, but if you're pushing it all out, your business is not going to survive. Yeah.
Yeah, well, exactly, and that's I think I've heard at least a handful of kind of podcast episodes, multiple shows where funded companies find themselves in a situation where their unit cost, they're essentially making a loss on the product as is, right? Which means they experience significant revenue growth, but the more revenue they get, the more money they're losing, right? And most people that see, like I said, like you would think someone in e-commerce understands what a darn gross margin is, right? But many people don't, right? So
math is hard.
Well, yes.
And this has
right?
been true for years, by the way. I remember back in the .com days where everybody's like, oh, yeah, we're losing money on every customer here, but we'll make it up in volume. I'm like, that's not how that works.
No, exactly right. And I think that's it. Like, you then get into the question of what scale actually looks like for, an e-commerce company in the next 5 to 10 years, because like economies of scale probably still exist. It probably just doesn't exist in like the way it did in the past, where you could say like, sure, I can only afford 100 units, manufacture 100 units of this thing now, and at greater volumes, like I can reduce that cost by 30%, right, over time as I can find more capital, right? I don't think that's what economies of scale necessarily looks like for e-commerce going forward. Economies of scale will have to come in different ways. Probably the most obvious one, and one that's close to my heart at least, is to think about what you can do for your brand, right? Because a brand can scale. It's probably not the most measurable thing that you can do or directly attribute growth to, but I think that's where the kind of the e-commerce brands that are going to win are the ones that are going to find those economies of scale in their brand, and not like within other things, not within their kind of specific customer acquisition channel that's working, or within kind of the their cost of inventory.
All right, switching gears, last question here. You obviously spent a huge amount of time in the WordPress space, and I can't imagine that after you left Woo that you just suddenly stopped thinking about WordPress altogether, because Conversio, for example, I know supports WooCommerce. So with that said, what are your thoughts about the WordPress space? Because they are seeing a ton of change in there right now. Gutenberg is on the scene. Automatic is making waves with Jetpack. All kinds of stuff is going on there right now. What do you think is the future of WordPress, and where do you think the biggest struggles or opportunities are in that space right now?
Yeah, so I'm going to surprise you here, Dave. Like once I got out of Woo, I literally got out of the WordPress ecosystem. And yes, Conversio does have a WooCommerce integration, but I am definitely not as anywhere close to kind of WordPress itself as I was kind of back in the day, right? I mean, I'm still a user, and I still think it's a great product, and Automatic is a really good company. But I don't have the dirt anymore, right? If you asked me like 5, 6, 7 years ago, like I would have some juicy tidbits about the ecosystem. That said, though, I think what is interesting is that to some extent, at least, I think everyone undervalues Automatic as a company, right? And doesn't necessarily understand just the magnitude of their reach, right? I mean, I think what they're up to, powering almost 40% of the internet, and if you add Tumblr now, like that number becomes significantly more, right? So you essentially have a company that has such a broad foundational base that if they were to properly monetize this, you have a massive company, right? And I think what is interesting and what is definitely in their favor in that sense is, and I see this often when people speak to me about Shopify versus WooCommerce, for example, where Shopify is the media darling and I mean fantastic company, but then you look at something like WooCommerce and like I know that whilst it's much harder for WooCommerce being a kind of distributed solution here to have the kind of merchant data that Shopify has, that in volume size, at least, they're probably there or thereabouts, right? But people don't perceive them as such, right? So I think, in that sense, I gut feel here is Automatic is a bit of a, and WordPress is a bit of a kind of sleeper company in that, in that regard. And as I said, if they can nail their, all of their, revenue opportunities in the next couple of years, yeah, I think it's going to be fascinating. But the but with WordPress is always that there is a tension between the capitalist mindset and the open source philosophies and ideologies. So whether kind of getting those aligned, and aligned in a way that's agile enough to really build a massive, like even bigger business, right? I think that's going to be interesting.
Okay, that's fair. I actually am surprised. I kind of thought, once you kind of get embedded in WordPress, you're just going to follow along with the news stream there. But yeah, I could see that getting into e-commerce would have distracted you there.
That's the other thing is I don't think it's just that. I think at least my kind of experience, from back in the day was, because it was open source as well, there are many cooks in the kitchen, and it's easy to have a loud voice and to shout at people, which means that there's just a bunch of politics as well. And to some extent, whilst I still have great friends in the space, and I don't think there's ill feelings, but I think to some extent as well, it was just, it was good for a phase of my life, and then I wanted something new, and I wanted to get out of that a little bit, if that makes sense, right? So, because there is a WordPress way, for doing things, and I basically exactly right. You know what I'm talking about, and like if you ask loads of people about the WordPress way, they everyone will have their own definition thereof, right? But there is a WordPress way, and I just wanted something a little bit different.
Okay. All right. I get it. I lied. There was actually one more question. And actually, I feel like this was the most important one. And it was the leading question on my list there. So you have a book of poetry coming out, correct?
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about that. And I'd like to hear, because this isn't something that you hear a lot of founders doing in general. It's not, you don't hear a lot of people doing this in general unless you're like, a lit major in college and you're writing poetry or reading poetry as part of your thesis or something like that. So why poetry? And this may be a bizarre question, but maybe not, because I think I know you well enough that there's probably a connection between the two. How does poetry help you be a better founder?
Yeah. So the backstory, Dave, is that when back in November 2017, right? So it's almost 2 years ago, went through a really challenging time in the business, had to retrench, lay off 2 team members, had to brutally kind of yank the business around to safety. And it was just a really tough time generally, right? And for some other reason, because the last exposure I had to poetry at all was, probably high school, right? And for some other reason, between, Jeff Bezos and one of those billionaire calls, that we had, but on my Kindle, I got a recommendation to pick up, a book of poetry by Rupi Kaur called Milk and Honey, and it's very much, contemporary poetry, which means also very different to kind of the poetry that I was exposed to, in high school, which is probably more like in that classical realm, right? And I started reading this, and Rupi's work is very raw, very emotive, very provocative, and for some reason, I think initially it was a complete distraction for me to, from the challenge that I was facing in business and life at the time. But I think in that as well, a big part of what resonated from her book was this idea of, really being yourself and putting your true self out there. And that process became really cathartic, right? And I essentially looked at it because I've always enjoyed writing this journey, and I've always used writing, whether it gets published or not, but I've used writing as a bit of therapy, right, just to kind of cleanse my mind and try and clarify some thoughts. But I essentially looked at that kind of the way she was writing, and I figured why I have emotions, like what would happen if I tried to put this in paper. And I think what ultimately ended up being really, really fun at the time was that I felt quite, kind of, which probably sounds ridiculous, kind of being an entrepreneur, but I felt constrained, like within the business, and like I felt there was a structure, like being profitable, having enough cash in the bank, like there were clear like markers of like do this, don't do that, do not fuck this up. And what the poetry ultimately did was, especially the kind of contemporary poetry that seemingly has no rules, right? You could just write a single line of text and words, and it becomes a poem. I mean, I think, from my upcoming book, for example, there is one poem that is simply the following line, which says, if I remember correctly, can I give you some of the Kool-Aid that I'm drinking? And that's a poem, right? But so my point being that, like, what I loved about that was it was really free form, and it was just such a different experience for me to be creative and to be able to do something that had didn't necessarily have any goals that it had to achieve, and it didn't have any requirements, right? And I think just through that, like ultimately, like where I'm at today, to answer your question then about, how it influences me as, as a founder, I think there's more of an artist, kind of in the way that I think about business, and not just this almost kind of industrialist, this worker bee kind of mindset. Someone that is, that wants to straddle, kind of more than, one perspective, not just capitalism, but capitalism and something else. And maybe it's not even just two things, maybe it's like three or four things, right? But I think that's at least what poetry, and it's a greater concept, kind of art, has done for me. Because I think most people, again, think, like, I went through this process, by the way, and again, like, I probably have too many words about this, but I started that journey thinking that, capitalism and business on one side and art was completely opposites. And I slowly started to merge those. And like I said, I think there's a intersection there where they overlap, where one can do really great, creative, valuable, profitable kind of work. Yeah. I don't know if that makes any sense.
That's fun. That's really cool. Thanks for sharing. So you're a little bit Carnegie, but you're a little bit Tennyson. And you're still one of the 10 youngest billionaires. So it's like you've got all the things going for you here.
Exactly. But remember, it's only 10 youngest in Africa. Like, that's important. You have to, like, the African heritage is important there.
Yes, of course. All right. So, Adii, can you tell people, if they want to read your poetry, or if they want to read your blog or connect with you further, what are the best ways to do that?
Yeah, so I'm hopefully back to my weekly publishing schedule on my blog, which is adii.me. Otherwise, I am also adii on both Twitter and Instagram. Instagram has some poetry. There is some poetry on my blog as well, and the book should be out. I will set myself a goal before the end of the month, if all goes well, and I will be announcing that or making available via my newsletter. So if anyone wanted to read my contemporary thoughts and poetry, that's the safest bet in terms of, kind of finding out when it is ready.
Awesome. Well, we're looking forward to seeing what comes next. And for those that are listening, if you have any thoughts or questions for Adii and we didn't ask them today, please send us an email, podcast@roguestartups.com. We'd be happy to follow up on that. And if you're enjoying the show, the one ask that we have is that we'd like you to share it with somebody you think could benefit. Thanks for listening. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Rogue Startups. If you haven't already, head over to iTunes and leave a rating and review for the show. For show notes from each episode and a few extra resources to help you along your journey, head over to roguestartups.com to learn more.